Good evening and welcome to this called meeting of the Northside Board of Trustees. Before calling this meeting to order, the board would like to take just a moment to briefly review some of the rules for conducting our meeting. Obviously, we are not meeting in person. On March 16th, Governor Greg Abbott granted a request by the Attorney General to temporarily suspend a limited number of open meeting laws to the extent necessary to allow telephonic or video conference meetings in response to the coronavirus COVID-19. I'll now ask Mrs. McGee to call the roll of the trustees.
I'll start with Dr. Harrell.
Present.
Mrs. Freeman.
Present. Shut the door.
Mr. Medina.
Present.
Mr. Lopez.
Present.
I believe Ms. Chumley is going to be late. Mr. Blunt.
Present.
Mrs. Reed.
Present.
Thank you, Ms. McGee. In accordance with those suspended rules mentioned before, we certify the following. Number one, notice of this meeting has been posted online for at least 72 hours. Number two, although members of the board are not gathered in a central physical location, we do have a quorum in attendance at this meeting by video conference. Number three, we are meeting by use of a software application which allows two-way communication for members of the public. Number four, as we would at any in-person meeting, members of the public who have followed the instructions on the meeting notice for registering to address a specific agenda item will be unmuted for 3 minutes to speak. If the speaker submitted written comments in advance, an electronic copy will be provided to all trustees. Number five, all other meeting procedures will adhere to board-adopted procedures to the extent practical. Number six, excuse me, an auto recording of this meeting is being made and will be available to the public at a later date. We apologize in advance for any unforeseeable difficulties and ask for your patience as we navigate unprecedented conditions. The order of business for this meeting is set out in the agenda. The meeting will then be officially called to order. Please bow your heads as Trustee Reed leads us in the invocation.
Thank you, President. Pray with me, please. Almighty and merciful God, we ask your guidance and blessings upon this board, students, parents, patrons, teachers, and administrators as we are assembled here this evening in the common pursuit of this great nation's wealth, our children. Amen.
Amen.
Would you now please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I have a flag. I pledge allegiance
To the
to
flag.
the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I don't have a Texas flag, so but we will do the Texas pledge also, if I can remember. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Reed. Very nice. All right, so let's go down to the agenda, and we are now moving to item number 12, Business and Finance, the budget review, Mr. Barajas, and recommended action for this is discussion only.
Dr. Hall, just a recollection that we do have someone signed up to speak on this topic.
Okay, so do you think they, would they speak before or after, do you think?
My recommendation would be before.
Okay, all right, so let me go over the rules for addressing the board. We value your opinions and we will listen to what you have to say, although we are restrained by law from taking any action. Please address your remarks to the board. Please confine your remarks to a Northside policy or practice. Please limit your remarks to 3 minutes. At 3 minutes, Dr. Woods will ask that you wrap up your remarks. And please do not make any personal attacks on individuals. Thank you. So who is going to speak first?
I believe Ms. Longoria is lined up to speak on this item.
Okay. Ms. Longoria, are you ready to address the board?
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I am ready. Good evening, Madam Chairperson, Trustee, and Dr. Woods. Today, Northside AFT would like to invite you, the district, to meet with the San Antonio Coalition of School Reopening, comprised of representatives from area schools and 14 community organizations, including Northside AFT and members of the local AFT, TSTA, NEA chapters. The coalition is strongly advocating for the guidelines set by the CDC, along with additional plans recommended by AFT, TSTA, NEA, and this week TEA on safely reopening schools. We've diligently worked to find similarities across all the plans to add depth and validity to the guidelines that protect students, staff, and community, while taking very complex plans and creating a much easier plan to follow. The San Antonio Coalition of Reopening Essential Safety and Shared Decision-Making is a coalition of students, parents, community members, union educators, and nonprofit organizations from Bexar County seeking to ensure that all decisions about safely reopening our schools center around the voices of students, their families, school workers, and communities that they serve. We ask that decisions about reopening our schools please include those who will be directly impacted, prioritizing student and worker safety above all. We must ensure that plans to safely reopen these critical public spaces, the very hearts of our community, are developed with those who work and study there. Our goal is to focus discussions about reopening schools on preserving human life, health, and safety, while continuing to address the fears, doubts, and unanswered questions expressed by students, parents, and educators. We assert that our priorities should be the physical, mental, emotional well-being of our youth, families, and communities. We look forward to working with government and district leaders from across our district to develop school reopening plans that prioritize students, workers, and community safely while following best health practices. Due to this, we put out a Northside AFT poll, and according to the results of our Facebook poll, about 80% of those who responded believed that their campus is not adequately prepared to reopen, while only about 20% did. Our questions to the district and TEA include: how do we ensure that campuses will be fully stocked on hand sanitizer, hand soap, face masks, face shields, gloves, disinfectant, toilet paper, paper towels, well-ventilated classroom, smaller class sizes to practice social distancing? We understand that the demand of these items were higher than the supply, even before these issues occurred with COVID. So once again, we would like for you to consider these things as you prepare the budget. Also consider the cost of living increase, and we're going to ask you as board members and Dr. Woods to please sign our HEROES Act that asks for more funding now that we know that the CARES Act was limited and did not bring funding to Texas. Thank you for your time. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Ms. Longoria. All right, moving right along to item 12 now, budget review. Mr. Barajas.
Just to paint a little context, Dr. Harrell, as the board knows, in a typical year, we would bring in April for discussion a first look at growth and improvement and compensation. That seemed...
Thanks to your big paper.
That seemed entirely impossible this year, given the uncertainty around budget. And I will say that very little has changed with regard to that uncertainty. However, the time has come for us to make budget decisions for the 2021 school year in the face of that uncertainty. And so what you'll see tonight is a presentation around those recommendations, both with regard to compensation and growth and improvement. They are extremely conservative recommendations given the uncertainty that exists. And what little certainty we have tells us that stable funding is going to be challenging to come by in the coming months and years. And so Renee's going to walk through the presentation, happy to take questions, and then we will likely bring these as items on next week's agenda for the board's consideration.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Brian. At any time as we're going through this information, if the board would like to have any more dialogue regarding anything listed on the slides, please stop me and say, can you provide more information? We've had this presentation bandied about for about 2 weeks now, so while it's not a long presentation, it does imply a lot of information regarding some of the things that Brian just mentioned. and where we are in the budget building process for 2020 and 21. So on the next slide, you'll see the somewhat meaty topics that we're going to cover. But again, given the situation we're in, we will tell you what we know regarding a lot of this information at this point, from the state funding update, a lot of information regarding the federal assistance, which we may or may not receive, all the way down to, again, talking about the fifth penny, which we want to continue to reiterate to the board the importance of that fifth golden penny and the caveat that it comes with regarding how to access it for this next year. And then finish up with some remaining steps on our budget calendar between now and August for us to have the board consider for adoption, not only the budget, but also the tax rate. So on the next slide, just a quick economic update. I mean, it's no surprise since March, not only the national economy, but certainly the Texas economy has taken a huge hit. And information that we've received probably over the last few months, the sales tax revenue is down considerably. Oil and gas production taxes also down. That's no surprise.
I saw your.
I know. I just have to celebrate.
If we look at just what happened to the price of oil over the last few months, there was actually a period of time, and I don't remember when it was exactly, but I remember Brian and I talking about it, that oil prices went negative for a short period of time. And, they've been down in the low 20s. They've been up as high as maybe in the high 30s, maybe 35. But if you go back to see what the state estimated the price of oil would be during this biennium, it was up in the 50s. So certainly that's going to have an impact on the state budget over this current biennium. Despite the fact that at the beginning of this biennium, they did start with a surplus of revenue, which essentially means that any of the dollars that the comptroller certified that could be used during this current biennium, they did not appropriate expenditures related to that. Well, that's a great thing, but it appears as though the pendulum has gone the other way, and we could potentially be looking at a shortfall of revenue over this biennium. The comptroller will be probably within the next month giving the state and the legislature an update on the current revenue. So we'll be waiting for that to see if that's going to have any impact on schools, not only for 1920, but certainly for the next biennium in 21-22, starting with 21-22. Okay, next slide. So for the year that we're ending, 1920, there does not appear to be any kind of reduced funding for the year that we're ending on August 31st, the end of our fiscal year. But there is going to be a swap of money between state dollars and federal dollars, and we'll talk about that more in a slide that deals with the CARES funding, and more specifically what we call the ESSER funding. As of right now, it does not appear in the second year of the biennium that there will be any kind of cut to schools, to the foundation school program. Jumping ahead, the last bullet indicates that while state agencies have been asked to cut their budgets by 5%, the two areas that were not part of that were the foundation school program and the teacher retirement system. However, if the comptroller gives a revenue estimate update and they react to that, there are a couple things that could happen to us in the second year of the biennium. 2021, the budget we're building. Proration simply means that there's not enough money to go around, so we may get some kind of cents on the dollar for FSP allotment, or foundation school program allotment. That has happened before. I don't remember what year. It goes back several years, but that certainly is something the state could do to us in the second year of the biennium. They could delay that last August of 2021 foundation school program payment to us, essentially kicking this problem into the next biennium. And I believe that saves, Brian, is that about $2 billion by doing that, which they have done before. For Northside, I believe the last time I looked at those numbers, that would mean about a $35 million payment that we would not get in August, but would get in September of 2021. Luckily, we're in a position to be able to absorb that, but unfortunately, other districts around the state maybe couldn't, and they'd have to go out and do some kind of borrowing if the state were to do that. The last one, which I put third because I don't think that they're going to want to do that, is to potentially use the Economic Stabilization Fund, also called the Rainy Day Fund, to shore up funding for this last year of the biennium.
Renee, if I can jump in here.
Sure.
So the statement around we don't have an indication that there's going to be a reduction of funding on a per pupil basis in 2021 is absolutely true. But I want to remind trustees that it presumes two things. It presumes, one, that there is no ADA loss, that we do not experience a loss of average daily attendance. And it also presumes that we would be fully funded to teach in a distance learning environment. And while those negotiations are ongoing, they have not been going particularly well of late. And so that is something else to keep in mind, additional layers of uncertainty as we build this budget.
And next slide, please. So getting down to brass tacks regarding the north side budget and where we are and what have we historically done. Between the two big components that drive any increased expenditures from one year to the next. The first one being growth and improvement. Those items that are requested and asked for by departments and certainly campuses to operate the next year, as well as on the next slide, which we'll go to here in a second, the comp plan. Sorry, I said that, Leanne. So growth and improvement. We went through this process probably right before we left for spring break and then kind of never came back. Going through all the different G&I packages that were put in, but we were able to get this down to essentially those core items that we feel, and you can see under significant items, they're all essentially curriculum related. There were some things that were perhaps being considered to include in the growth and improvement, but as we started to see, April, May, certainly into this month, that perhaps we need to delay some of those other expenditure requests that were coming in through the G&I. And this is what currently we have settled on between the superintendent, senior staff, and cabinet. So it's about $9.2 million that is being recommended that the board will consider for approval a week from today on Tuesday. Again, that those are some significant items that were included. I believe the board did also receive within the last week or so the G&I packages. So there's a lot of detail in there that you could have gone through and certainly looked at. And if there's any questions you have regarding that, I think that we can certainly address them now, or if you want to get those over to your superintendent.
Okay. Mr. Brojas, there are two questions, Mr. Blunt and then Mr. Lopez. Mr. Blunt.
That's right. Yeah, just a real quick question to Dr. Wood's statement on the ADA side of the house. Will there need to be a redefinition of ADA depending on the different situations we're looking at? I can't remember if it requires actual physical presence or how it's defined.
Yes, sir. Right now it requires physical presence. We've been working with the commissioner to redefine ADA for some weeks now. And that's what I said. That was what I meant when I said that we've been negotiating on that point. And unfortunately, in the last couple of days, those negotiations have not been going particularly well.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. Mr. Lopez?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, my question centered around the ADA as well, and Bobby asked that very well. Thank you, Bobby, for asking that question. The second one had to do with when we look at the funding for ADA, are we going to get most of our funding due to this lapse in not attending for this year? So we're okay with that so far?
Yes, sir. The agency published relatively early on essentially a hold harmless for the 1920 school year, and we've been operating under that hold harmless. We have been told very clearly that hold harmless will not continue into the future.
Just wanted to make sure that I understood that, or if anybody else understood that too. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Trustee Lopez, we'll get into a little bit more of an issue regarding that hold harmless ADA when we talk about the federal funding.
Okay.
That I'd like the board to be aware of regarding the CARES funding.
Okay.
Let's hold up and see if there are others.
Yes. Ms. Freeman? Thank you, Mr. Lopez.
Thank you, Dr. Harrell. Dr. Woods, so I do hear anticipation of an announcement regarding ADA this Thursday. Although I know that, what do you hear currently? As of today, do we anticipate an announcement regarding ADA from Mike Morath, our commissioner, on Thursday?
No, ma'am, I do not. I think that's going to be delayed again.
Okay. So a week, not sure.
Latest I understand is Tuesday of next week, but that's moved several times. There's, as you can imagine, he is taking lots of input. I'll just say it that way. Some of which is from school people, a small number of school people, a very small number of school people, and then I'm sure the state leadership.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Freeman. And then Mr. Barajas and Dr. Woods, I had a real quick question too. Remind us some of the costs associated with distance learning that would be impacted or would impact our budget. What are some of the major costs? How about that?
Dr. Harrell, we're actually going to cover that in a slide coming up, if that's okay.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, we're kind of talking about the more of the revenue side here, and then we'll get to the expenditure side here coming up.
Perfect. Any other questions?
One comment I want to make about that slide is, as you know from prior years, this is stripped down about as far as we could get it. Essentially, the lion's share of the dollars are dedicated to schools we anticipate opening in the coming year or second year. And there is a little bit of dollars dedicated to those initiatives that we were so excited to start at the beginning of the 1920 school year, to include pre-K and STEM lab expansion. But as you can see, they are, in a district our size, very modest dollars. The one thing I want to be perfectly clear on is that the item you see there with regard to technology, that is items around licensing and those kind of mandates. This has nothing to do with standing up technology to support large-scale distance learning. We'll allude to that both later in this presentation and in the task force report.
Okay.
Hi guys, I'm here. I just wanted to tell you, I'm sorry I'm late.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome. We're going over the budget. All right, Mr. Barajas, thank you.
And if I could add one point to that, is that while we are putting everything that we can think of regarding what if we do enter next year, and of course the task force will cover all the items they've come up with regarding what school will look like in August and September. And certainly that's going to have an inherent cost that's perhaps different than what we've done in the past to start up school. Everything that we think we're headed toward, we will try to assign a cost to it, include in the adopted budget that we present to the board in August. However, we know that there's going to be some things that come up that we didn't anticipate. So I think that as best as we can, we're going to try to put all the knowns in the budget. But I think we need to at least probably either recognize any kind of increase in costs that nobody could fathom would happen, and adjust them through the budget amendment process, BA1, and so on and so forth. Or we could possibly just go ahead and include in the adopted budget a dollar amount of money that sits there specifically only to be used for those unknown costs that may hit us and every other school district if we are going to be doing this distance learning, hybrid, kids in class kind of model. So there are some unknowns that we have to think about, but we'll see as we get better information through June, certainly into July. And next slide, Leanne, please. So the second component, the other side of the expenditure coin for any kind of increase to the budget is certainly what we're going to do with compensation. At this time, there is no recommendation for any kind of general increase for all the reasons that Brian has covered regarding the uncertainty of funding, not only for the next year, 2021, but also for the next biennium. And I think that it's prudent for us to go ahead and wait to see what's going to happen down the road before we commit to any kind of general increase. General increase to the general fund, 1% is about $8 million. That's almost equal to what we're including in the budget for those G&I items. However, there is a small component regarding the recommended compensation plan that will be brought to the board next Tuesday. Market adjustments, this district goes through a process every year of trying to make sure that we are within a certain percentage of the market. In this case, we're going to 90% and a few reclassifications. But if you can tell, those costs were, well, it is $354,000 in a budget that is almost $1 billion. You can tell it's a very, very minimal, almost de minimis cost to the budget.
Mr. Barajas, it looks like Ms. Freeman has her hand up. Ms. Freeman?
I'm sorry, Dr. Harrell. I didn't lower my hand from the last time.
Okay, thanks.
I could just make a comment here, Dr. Harrell. What you see in these recommendations is an effort very much like what some will remember in 2010 and 2011, where we were trying to do two main priorities: continue to serve our students without interruption and save jobs. And that is the mode that we are in, starting now and likely for a while. And so while I know that folks are disappointed around recommendations that don't expand programs more rapidly, and obviously a recommendation that doesn't increase compensation, we are in the mode at this point of trying to avoid service loss to students and families and to avoid job cuts to employees.
Okay, Dr. Woods, I just wanted to capture that you said service loss, loss of jobs.
That was it.
Right? Okay, but all current programs, we're not looking at like cutting anything fine arts. These were anything that we were going to expand upon, like our STEM labs, like pre-K. So expansion projects only, but not current services to students.
We are recommending no cuts given what we know today, and certainly would not do that without a healthy conversation with the board.
Okay, thank you. All right, Mr. Barajas?
Wait,
Okay.
Carol, I just had one question. Brian, so on the market adjustments, are those similar to what we have done before, where we've just looked across the market, and it could be paraprofessionals, it could be, you know, facilities, it could be whatever area where we're just seeing that we are low from a market perspective in Bexar County?
That's exactly what it is. We've got a handful of groups. You know, we do an annual market study, and we try not to let folks float too low in the market. And so even in this lean year, we didn't want some small groups of employees, like there's a group of secretaries, for instance, to float too low in the market. So we recommend a small adjustment to keep them in a more healthy position.
Okay, thank you.
And real quick, I have a housekeeping. Leanne, I am not seeing, now I see Melissa Chumbley. I don't see Joseph Medina on my list. So I'm looking for hands, but I don't see.
Joseph hasn't joined us yet.
Well,
Okay.
Joseph is showing, but he's showing under the name of Carol Harrell.
Oh, okay. I can fix that.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And now I do see Melissa Chumbley as, okay.
Do you see my hand?
Katie, your hand is not up.
Well, I've been trying to get it up and I got something else on my screen. I had one other question.
Sure,
Does
go.
that mean we have to curtail the progress that we're trying to make on the new CAS school?
No, ma'am, that is not part of the plan. We're still trying to make that progress.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. And just, I'm giving it another 30 seconds to see if I can get Joseph up on here.
And guys, for some reason, whatever piece I'm in, I can't find a raise the hand. That's right. I'll find it. I'll reach out to Leanne if I can.
Okay. And then when we're not in a slide, I can also see your hands. So let me, it's over under the participants. If you look at the list of participants, it's the bottom right.
Yeah, I found it. It's just not.
Okay, yours works.
Can you see it now?
It did, it did.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so is it down now, Carol? I'm having a problem.
It's up. It's waving at me.
Okay, all right, good. I think I'm good. Thank you.
We're great, we're great. Okay, I see Joseph now. Okay, all right, sorry about that. Thank you very much for your patience. All right, Mr. Barajas.
And to Trustee Reed's question on slide number 5, under significant items, CAST was included as part of the package that we're recommending be included in the budget for next year.
Thank you.
So going on to the next slide. So the business types always look at the budget from more of this kind of format. One column that tells you whether it's a revenue and expenditure, the next column showing you the dollar amount. So all of the things that we talked about up to this point can be distilled down into this one page, which is really the budget, because when the board adopts the budget, it's done in a financial format. You can see the effective fund balance. So there we're showing the revenues minus the expenditures, and then something that is unique that I've not seen in many districts that I've been into is that we have committed and assigned fund balances that are set up at some point in the past that we rely on over the future to pay for expenditures that we know are going to be included in future budgets. So while revenues minus expenditures indicates a $6.2 million loss, when you factor in the opening new schools, which this district has been doing for a long time, put that fund balance off to the side, technology deployments, which again is going back to that amount seems to be a very common amount in every budget based on what our technology department is doing. And then also an amount of money that is actually called state revenue deficits, rather than being state revenue, that is there to supplement those expenditures of $962 million as of today. So it actually shows that we're using $14 million of fund balance, which the bottom line shows that the net results of operations puts us in a positive situation. So we're not using unassigned fund balance to pay for operations. That's always very dangerous if you're relying on your savings account, which is unassigned fund balance to pay for basic operations. That's a very slippery slope that certainly this budget is not going to even get near. But I did want to point out that the use of the categorical fund balance is something that this board has seen probably over the last several years, if going back maybe even 10 years, as far as the process by which Northside looks at and adopts its budget. And next slide, please.
Just want to reiterate that both revenue and expenditures those numbers are much less certain than they would normally be at this time of year. Normally, we would be able to estimate revenues to within $10 million on a $1 billion budget. That is not the case, and that expenditure number does not include items that we'll discuss coming up around the technology and other expenses that will support large-scale distance learning for long periods of time.
So this slide was put together just as we were getting all this information from TEA regarding the CARES funding, and then all the different components of what it was dealing with. So it's very busy, but there are 3 takeaways from this, and you could, if you've not already read it, you can kind of go through it, is this federal money that Texas ISDs are receiving. There's an item on TEA's website which shows a PDF of every single district in the state and how much of this ESSER funding they're getting. And Northside ISD is eligible for $17 million and change. We still have to apply for it, and we are going through that process. In fact, it was released last week, the application process. The second takeaway from all this is that there is another pot of money within the CARES. So just think of CARES as the umbrella, and underneath it is the ESSER. And then there's the CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which will allow us to apply for any kind of reimbursement of expenditures we incurred for a certain time period, in this case, March 1st only through May 20th. And if it's allowable, then we could possibly get up to 75% of those allowable expenditures reimbursed to us. So back when this started happening, we made sure to code every expenditure related to Northside dealing with the coronavirus in the event that there was going to be some kind of reimbursement process. And sure enough, it showed up. But we still don't know whether or not all the costs that we have are going to be eligible. But we're certainly going to read through all the information and submit what we think is eligible. TEA referred to them as additive costs, but we have a good group of people looking at this to make sure that we can capture everything and apply for this money. We are limited to the greater of $50,000, or in Northside's case, up to $12 million in reimbursement. That's only the 75%. We don't have, at this point, $12 million of COVID-19 related expenditures, but we'll certainly be keeping the superintendent abreast of when we apply for this and how much that money will come at some point down the road. The third takeaway, I think I said there were two takeaways. There's three. The third one is that right now we don't expect any kind of additional funding from the federal government for our basic operations in 2021. We're back to, as Brian alluded to, ADA, FSP, and all these other kinds of things. If that were to be made available, that would certainly help. But would the state do the same thing they did with the first funding, which was the ESSER? So this is the way it works. Because we did not have a 5th and 6th weeks ADA, because all the kids were receiving instruction via distance learning, the state said that we're going to call that ADA hold harmless. But they wanted to do a calculation to say, well, what have you historically had in the 5th and 6th weeks last year, for instance? What was your total ADA for 18-19 in relation to the ADA you received in 18-19 only from 6-week periods 1 to 4? If that ratio was 0.99, that means they were going to apply that ratio to our ADA for periods 1 through 4, and that is what they are going to use the CARES funding to essentially fund this hold harmless. So just think about it, that if 100% of our money was going to come from the FSP, to make it simple, they took a portion of the FSP away and filled it in with the ESSER funding or the CARES funding. So there is no additional federal money on top of our state dollars for us to use going into next year or even to cover costs this year. It was a swap of money. And I think initially a lot of us thought that this was going to be money on top of all of our other state and local funding, but the state, and there's been a lot of discussion about this and some really good articles written about how the state took the federal funding and simply didn't plug a hole they had, but moved the FSP away and used that dollar. But they also had this caveat in there that 5% of that $17 million has to be shared with private schools in our area, which in our case would mean a reduction of about $867,000 of that $17 million if everybody who's eligible comes and says, I want my share of that. One thing that, yes.
Real quick, Ms. Chumbley has a question. Ms. Chumbley?
Sure. Carol, I was going to kind of wait. I was going to see, Renee, you're explaining it right now. Carol, that my question was on this piece of it, but let me just ask it and then I'm sure you'll address it, Renee. So those charter schools that call themselves public schools, they're not going to be penalized this as well? Or is it just do we have charter schools that don't identify themselves as public schools? I mean, I know about the private schools, parochial schools, but
the charter schools would not be considered private. But since you mentioned that, the charter schools are not subject to the 5% reduction the way other Texas public ISDs are.
I'm not understanding that because they keep telling and advertising and marketing that they are public ISDs, that they are public, not ISDs, but they are public schools.
All right.
So I'm not understanding the reasoning behind that.
The rationale from the state is that because they don't have a geographic service area, that the rule does not apply to them.
So,
well, I think everyone knows what I think about that. Thank you.
You would not be alone in that opinion.
So there's a lot of moving parts regarding not only the ESSER funding that we will have to apply for, despite the fact that it is a swap of state dollars for federal dollars, as well as a CRF. And we'll certainly, again, keep the superintendent abreast of our filing of the application and any possible COVID-related expenditures that we're going to get reimbursed through this other pot of money. Now, that other pot of money, the CRF, if a lot of districts start asking for this reimbursement, they're going to do what anybody would do, which is there's not enough, so they're going to start to reduce the amount that they would normally give to any district because the pot's going to run out pretty quickly.
Yeah, just a point of emphasis. I think we've driven home the point about the ESSER funding, but around the reimbursement funding, just a point of emphasis perhaps for media on the call is that the vast majority of COVID-related expenditures will not have occurred by May the 20th. They're occurring this summer in order to stand up school for next year. So that's an important point for folks to understand, and we'll look at our expenditures to date here in a few minutes.
So next slide, Leanne, please.
Wait, Renee, just one more question and I'll let it go. So what about all of the cost in relation to the feeding and the care that we've been providing? Is that something that we will have any type of reimbursement or support with?
It's my understanding that the CRF will not allow anything from food service. It's very specific on the allowable activities, and of course we'll go through that to make sure that we can pick up anything that happened during that time period. And Brian is exactly right. Expenditures that you incurred after May 20th are not eligible. So it's a very definitive time period that we will gather everything and see what we can ask for reimbursement.
Is there anything in the guidelines in relation to how the federal monies were supposed to be applied that is questionable in relation to how the state's handling this?
No, they made a choice that was legal, but they clearly made a choice.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
So we're talking about the COVID-19 expenditures to date. As you can see, breaking it out, it's a total of about $2.1 million. There is with the board we talked about during the month of May regarding the premium pay that we had to have the hearing, but the personal protective equipment, that's almost $600,000 that we have spent, about $250,000 in cleaning supplies, the distance learning materials and related technology to get geared up to do that. You can see that that's almost $650,000. So we're going to have to go through all of this and determine, okay, first of all, what of this is eligible to get reimbursed, and are we going to incur this through May 20th? And there are some of these things that are on here actually that we anticipate are going to go beyond May 20th, and they wouldn't be eligible, unfortunately. So we're going to see how much of this we're going to be able to get back through that relief fund. Now, one thing, going back to the ESSER, the swap, I'll call it, the swap of the state dollars for the federal dollars. Essentially, we can only swap those expenditures because, remember, this is still considered to be a federal dollar that they're giving to us in lieu of the FSP payment. So we can only look at expenditures that we are going to move from the general fund over into this other fund to account for the use of $17 million, essentially. So we don't have the whole year to say, well, let's apply these expenditures to that and be done with it. So we had a meeting, the budget department, finance department last week to really talk about this. And this is not going to be as easy as maybe some people think, because you can only take expenditures that you incurred from, let's say, March 13th or March 1st to the end of August 31st. And we're finding that we don't have a lot of expenditures because most of our expenditures have already incurred. We don't want to just assign it to payroll and move on, because then that involves time and effort that has to be filled out by employees. So we're trying to take the path of least resistance to use the money appropriately to just get into 2021 and get this behind us. So we're trying to work through that as we over the next few weeks and months. And next slide, please, Leanne. So the other side of the budget coin is the revenue. What revenue have we lost as a result of shutting the campuses down, turning into an organization that was delivering instruction online? Well, from facility rentals, the Early Child Collaborative, and community education, we're estimating about $820,000. Again, with a budget of about $1 billion in revenue, is that something we can bounce back from? Certainly, but it still is a loss of revenue. Now, child nutrition, a completely different fund. The board adopts the three funds: general fund, debt service, and child nutrition. They're estimating a loss of about $13 million in revenue. However, because of the fact that they also are going to be see a reduction in expenditures, they have indicated that they're going to have a net loss for 1920 somewhere between $2.8 and $3.2 million. Child nutrition does have a fund balance just like the general fund, so they're going to be able to absorb that for 1920. Learning Tree also had about a reduction of about $2.8 million in revenue. Child nutrition should receive another $2.8 to $3.2 million loss for 2021. Is probably also sustainable, but we're getting to the point then where any future years where they're going to see any kind of loss in in fund balance or results of operations, the general fund is going to have to be there to back them up. And the general fund may not be in a position necessarily to always be able to do that transfer to keep child nutrition up. So we have a lot of unknowns, as Brian mentioned at the beginning, of what we have to look for, not only for 2021, but also the next biennium and the one after that. Next slide, please. So just kind of a refresher on the whole notion of HB3 and property values. We are currently using current year values. We are presently using current year values, no longer having the lag that benefited districts like Northside, which had increasing property rates. Regarding our tax rate, we have to wait for TEA to assign our M&O rate for 2021, which based on our estimate right now, working with one of our consultants, we're only looking at about a 2.5% increase in property values next year. That's kind of in the middle between a high estimate and a low estimate. So if we go with that number, our M&O rate, maximum compressed tax rate, or the MCR, is going to be 0.9164 as compared to 0.93 where it is right now. That's before we add any kind of golden pennies on top of that. So if we go to the next slide, Leanne, we can talk about that fifth penny and what it does for us. So again, going back and reiterating this, just to make sure the board understands that House Bill 3 does allow access for Northside to a fifth golden penny in the year 2021, on top of what we think is going to be our compressed tax rate of 0.9164, and that's based on our expected property value increase. Again, the vote to adopt the tax rate has to be unanimous. If it's not unanimous, then we only get 4 pennies. That fifth penny, which by the way was included a few slides back showing the revenues and expenditures and use of fund balance, is worth about $12 million to us. So without that $12 million in additional dollars related to the golden penny, the very bottom number would actually turn red because we would be in a negative situation of not having enough in what we use for fund balance as well as revenue to cover our planned expenditures. And I just want to reiterate that regarding the tax rate compression, as our tax rate goes down because of compression, because property values, for instance, if they're going up, the state is very clear that it doesn't matter. You're not going to lose any revenue because you are entitled to a certain dollar amount based on the mixture of kids you have. So as districts are experiencing a 93-cent M&O rate, a 91, 88, 85, whatever it happens to be, in theory, under House Bill 3, it really doesn't matter because the state's going to come in with state dollars to keep you whole for what your capital E entitlement is for. Unless there's another pandemic and then all of a sudden we get federal dollars and they take those and do other kind of machinations with those dollars, so we're not sure, but again, that's how it's supposed to work. And on the next slide, just some upcoming budget calendar milestones. On June 23rd, again, the board will be considering administration's recommendation for the growth and improvement packages that we'd like to include in next year's budget, as well as the compensation plan. In August, the board will call for the public hearing, where at the hearing we will discuss the budget and the proposed tax rate. August 25th, the administration will bring to the board and superintendent a budget for 2021 to be considered for approval. And should we get our MCR from TEA in enough time for us to also adopt the tax rate on the 24th, then as in years past, we'll get that done. If we don't have enough information and we want to delay it until September, then September 22nd will be the date that we have planned for the board to consider adopting the 2020 total tax rate, M&O plus the debt service. And that is all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barajas. Are there any questions or comments?
I can't get my hand to raise
All
up.
right, Ms. Reed?
The fifth penny does not come into play this coming year. It comes into play the following year. Is that the way I understood that?
No, ma'am. The fifth penny is for the 2021 year, the budget we're building.
Okay.
And you can access it in future years, 21, 22, 22, 23. However, in those years, the vote to adopt the tax rate does not have to be unanimous. It's only this year, 2021, that it has to be unanimous. So hypothetically, if a district, anywhere ISD, suggested the fifth penny and it was not unanimous, they would only get 4. But the following year, if they recommended the fifth golden penny and it was not unanimous, they still get it because, again, it's majority vote for the second year. It's only this year that it has to be unanimous.
So does it have to be voted on separately, or is just voted in with the budget as presented?
Well, the budget and tax rate are always voted separately, the budget first and the tax rate second, but it's part and parcel of the whole normal process for us to adopt the tax rate in any year that we've done before. So the fifth penny doesn't have to be considered separately. It's just part of the recommended total tax rate broken up between M&O and INS.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Reed. Any other questions? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Brohaus again. We will move right along to,
Thank you, Leanne.
and thanks, Leanne, too. We'll move down to item 16, Superintendent. And did we also have a citizens to be heard?
We have someone signed up to speak to this agenda, yes. It's Ms. Longoria.
Okay. All right, Ms. Longoria, are you ready to speak?
I will pass since I already dealt with the task force earlier through the coalition and description. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, Dr. Woods, Northside Task Force recommendations, recommended action discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Harrell. We have had a group working under the leadership of Dr. Brenda Ward for a number of weeks now to consider this question that we're all struggling to answer, and that is, what will school look like in August? And so we've asked these folks to answer questions that are pretty hard for anybody to answer right now. And I'll say that for context, that what you see tonight is not a plan. It's not a, this is the way we're going to do it. There's way too much uncertainty still without state guidance on what the public health situation will look like, without knowing how distance learning might be funded. We don't have a plan, but what you've got is some really good thinking from a really smart group of people around what are some options that once we do have more guidance, we might be able to employ to educate our students the very best way that we can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ward. I want to thank her and all of the members of the task force. These folks have worked a lot of hours in the last 4 or 5 weeks to get this generated. And I know that this will put us in a very favorable position to have as good a plan as we can once we feel like we've got enough information to execute that. So, Dr. Ward.
Thank you, Dr. Woods, and good evening to the Board of Trustees. I would like to update you on the work of the Northside Task Force on reopening schools for your consideration. Please feel free to stop me throughout the presentation if you have any questions for myself or the other task force members who are here and ready to answer your questions. Dr. Harrell, if you'll stop me if you see the board members to raise their hand. Here is their task force members, and we had 19 members, and we met 6 times over a 3-week period and coordinated interdepartmental efforts on planning a safe and responsive recommendations for school opening in the fall. Additionally, each task force member had a subcommittee for their area that worked to research law, best practices in their area, and make decisions on Northside recommended procedures that you'll hear tonight. They then brought back their work to the main committee, and we ensured coordination between the departments. Dr. Woods gave us a charge to create a structure returning students to school and staff to buildings that could be implemented with less than 2 weeks' notice, that we could put a certain number of groups or a certain % of students in buildings and be nimble enough to change quickly as the public health situation and student needs change. They asked us 15 questions, and you'll see our answers throughout our presentation and for your viewing. So we are going to show you our objectives next. We were trying to formulate multiple plans, as Dr. Woods alluded to bring students back and staff back to buildings in a manner that's both safe and responsive. to prepare for gradual relaxations of social distancing, yet waves of stopping and starting with possible 14 to 28 days of rolling school closures. And we needed to consider partial or staggered openings. So I just want to reiterate the idea that we're bringing you multiple plans and not a solution for a one-time solution. So we considered the following novel challenges to the situation. Of course, the changes in the state of the public health crisis and the regulations with the health guidance, that we will not be able to fill all classrooms, have crowded hallways or cafeterias, that we will have those possible rolling closures due to outbreaks that could be predicted to be 2 weeks to 4 weeks. And then individual school closures due to an outbreak at one or more campuses, that we would have 2 to 5 days to sanitize the building before we would bring people back to the building. That we could possibly have low school attendance, that we will deal with learning loss of students from this spring, and differentiated strategies based on the school level and student vulnerability in who we bring back to our campuses first. So previously you received a live binder link from Mrs. McGee, and it has a lot of detailed information. So this is going to be kind of a general overview, although long. So our draft procedures and timelines are there for you to view. And it comes at the guidance from the Center for Disease Control, the governor, the Texas Education Agency, which, as you know, has changed throughout the summer, and we expect more changes. So as draft plans are approved, they will be finalized in this binder, in the same binder that you received. So our first tab to look at is general considerations, and some sub-tabs under there, which are regulatory flexibility and a communication plan. So the communication department has put together a 3-page communication plan. We believe this is an essential piece of our plan to show the community that we're taking the necessary safety precautions. We surveyed our community on their opinion about their children coming back to Northside schools in the fall. This information will be shared later in the presentation, but it clearly shows that if we can show our community the steps we will take for safety and sanitation, that they will feel more secure in sending their children back to campus. So that communication plan is going to be very important. And then regulatory flexibility, we've made 5 recommendations. You've already mentioned a couple of them earlier in your comments. The first one being the state policymakers might consider providing the flexibility for schools to base student progression on demonstrated mastery of competencies or grades rather than on seat time. Secondly, that the state should determine what constitutes attendance and statutory school day in the context of remote learning, and begin to assess how possibly reducing the total number of in-person school days or instructional hours might change and need full ADA funding. Third, that the state and Texas Education Agency should allow school districts to determine the number of students who fit in a classroom dependent to fulfill the social distancing requirements, while still considering the square footage of a room. And that they would also determine what PPE is needed for school districts, ensure that we can actually procure it and ensure that's possible. And finally, the U.S. Department of Education, we would request that they would allow up to 15% of Title IV funds to be used for technology equipment, as we will need for distance learning this year. I do want to point out that in number 3 and number 4, some of these things are partially accomplished thanks to Dr. Woods and other advocates for our students. TEA has also released that instead of allowing 10 students per room, they will allow up to 22 as long as we're keeping the social distancing 6-foot requirements. And so that has already been an improvement. And TEA is sending some PPE to districts. So I think that they have definitely heard Dr. Woods and others advocating for us. The largest tab of the binder, as I'm sure you saw, was under school operations, and many sub-tabs here to discuss. So This is probably our largest area of our presentation tonight. Some of this information is going to be too small for you to really view on this PowerPoint, but I wanted to just show you what it looks like in the binder so that you can see that we've taken a lot of detail into account. The task force reviewed the CDC guidelines and the square footage of each room in the school building to see how many students could safely fit in an area. On the right side of the screen, you see a new elementary design guide with the exact square footage of each area. On the left, you'll see a typical 806 square foot classroom, and see we can fit up to 16 students with their desks being 6 foot apart and all students facing forward as required by the CDC. Additionally, the teacher has 45 square feet of space to meet the required safety measures. The TE guidelines updated on June 9th now allow this plan, where previously a week ago their plan was only 10 people allowed per room no matter the square footage. So we see this as an improvement. The school operations subcommittee members are visiting every campus to ensure we take into account each classroom, and we will have an individualized campus plan for every campus. Public health accommodations also includes constant sanitation of every area in the school building. Frank Bayardo has reworked the custodial staffing schedule to ensure that more custodians are present during the day and keep the classrooms constantly clean and sanitized, which means we'll have less staff in the evening, but less staff will be needed because the school will be clean throughout the day. So you can view the staffing schedule on the left for a high school showing staggered arrivals. At the bottom left of the screen, he's modeled square footage of each high school and the number of labor hours to ensure this proactive sanitizing routine can occur, and the number of full-time employees needed. On the right is a sample of O'Connor High School with a scheduled area for each custodian. This type of scheduling will be completed for every school in the district. This slide is probably difficult to read, but Don Schmidt, along with other task force members, is working to ensure that we have all of the items necessary for every school and every classroom to provide a safe environment for our students and staff. This includes touchless thermometers, masks, face shields, soap, hand sanitizer, gloves, and many more items. The current TEA guidelines provided to districts on June 9th only allow 2 groups of up to 22 students in a cafeteria. Our elementary cafeterias are about 3,000 square feet. If you could imagine a high school with about 3,000 students to feed at a lunch period, you would not be able to feed them during the day. Even if you started at 9 o'clock and ended at 4 o'clock, we wouldn't be able to feed all of the students with only allowing 2 groups of 22 at one time. So after reviewing the current guidelines, the task force suggests that we have grab-and-go meals that are delivered directly to the classroom at elementary, middle, and high school. We also realize community need for food and are considering providing students at the community eligibility provision campuses, they're also called the CEP campuses, with a supper meal instead of an after-school snack. Transportation in our typical 72-passenger bus will now be limited to about 12 students. So to follow the social distancing 6-foot considerations, we must sit 1 student per row on alternating sides. A bus would have to go back and forth from the school to the neighborhood 6 times to pick up the same number of students. They would also have to sanitize the bus after each drop-off. Tessie Garza and her staff predict that we can transport about 50% of our eligible students to and from school under these guidelines. This also requires earlier pickup and later drop-off times. And I saw that Ms. Chumley raised her hand. Ms. Chumley?
I just, Ward, I thought that was changing. So that's not the case. This is still the guidelines we're under? Is this type of limit on our transportation?
We are hoping that that will change, and we don't have that guidance in writing yet.
Yeah, I want to be clear that what you're looking at is us trying to comply if guidance did not change. We do anticipate changes in guidance similar to what we're seeing coming from the governor's office about reopening the state. But until we have that guidance, we can't make plans to adjust to it.
Any other questions about transportation? Okay, as you know, extra and co-curricular activities are very important to our students. A subcommittee of the task force led by Sonia Almanza has thoroughly researched the CDC guidelines, UIL guidelines, and TEA guidelines to ensure that we offer as many programs as we can in a safe manner. On this slide, you can see a plan for student conditioning that is now allowed and has begun. Each sport, it kind of depends on how much contact there is in the sport. There's high contact, medium contact, or no contact sports. And so they considered each and have different regulations for each one. In addition to sports, James McCoke, our leader of the Fine Arts Department, has also considered guidelines for each fine arts program. One example of a change under the current guidelines is if we consider students playing an instrument in the school, they have to be 10 feet apart instead of 6 feet apart. So if you think of your typical marching band, they could never be in the band hall at the same time together. Instead, they would have to come in different periods of the day to practice, such as separating them by woodwinds, brass, or percussionists.
Brenda, real quick, would that same logic apply to spacing in PE and choir and dance, where there's more physical activity and distancing looks different because of airflow?
You're exactly right. Yes. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. The task force also is reconsidering how large group meetings and professional development can be run. So we're going to consider each meeting on the district master calendar and decide whether the objectives of the meeting can be accomplished online or whether they must be face-to-face following the social distancing rules. And then school personnel, you can imagine, is a huge job to rethink people working from home, some people working from the campuses. So the HR team worked with our legal counsel to adopt our procedures for staff in these areas. Mark Rustin served as a task force committee, and he already has put together many of the procedures, such as how to give guidance to staff who have a COVID-19 absence. Mark was pulled also to the safety subcommittee as well as the academic subcommittee to ensure we consider not only our students but our staff in each recommendation. Here's an example of some of the work they've done and what they've considered rethinking under our current guidelines from COVID. And then the academics committee, I'm going to give you a little, oh, Mr. Lopez, yes, sir. I think your hand is raised. Is Mr. Lopez muted?
Yeah, no, I'm unmuted. Thank you. So I had a question around the when you talk about the COVID-19. Let's say an employee has catches the virus. How many work days does that employee have, or is he allowed to have, or is he allowed to miss without losing any type of losing any money from because of this virus? Do we have something like that? Do we know that?
Yes, I'm going to kick that to Mark Rustin, and that's why we have our task force here so that they can answer all of your questions. So Mark, I'm going to kick that one to you if you will unmute yourself.
Absolutely. So Mr. Lopez, there's federal guidance that we've been given that there are 80 hours of paid leave given to each employee who's impacted by the coronavirus. Of course, we're running ours through our benefits department, so there is a qualification feature, and we've made it a pretty hearty vetting process. We do want to make sure that they do qualify as per the guidelines that have been put in place by the federal government, but there certainly is a process in place for that, and it's 80 initial hours of coronavirus.
And that's only up to a certain amount of time. Am I correct? For it's not going to be like for 2021 or anything. It'll only just be up to what, this year?
Correct. As it stands right now, that's the guidance we've been given is for this particular school year.
Okay.
And as we go into 2021 as well.
Now, would this apply for? So let's say we have one person that contracts the virus. What about if there's other people that worked around that individual? Would they qualify as well for that type of relief?
So Jennifer Kruger is on this task force as well, and we've worked closely together in the last few weeks, our departments in determining this. And this guidance actually has changed a couple of times. It's a pretty fluid situation. In fact, we just touched base today regarding that change. So there are different levels of exposure. If there's a level 1 exposure, meaning they're directly exposed to someone who has tested positive, there is an immediate 14-day quarantine that goes into effect. We do advise that they go get tested. If it's and until they're symptom-free, or the 14 days, which is the guidance that we've been given. If there's a level 2 or 3 exposure, we do ask that they quarantine until there's no symptoms, or if there are no symptoms, it's 10 days. Is that correct, Jennifer? On that particular, if it's a level 2 or 3 exposure.
If the individual, yes, good evening, everybody. If our employee is directly exposed to someone else, there's that initial 14 days, and then it comes into play if they are actually in the same household. Then there's some additional guidance that they have that their 14-day quarantine would not actually begin until the household member had resolution of the symptoms. They've been fever-free themselves for 72 hours without the use of fever-reducing medication and things like that. So it could be longer than 14 days if it's a household contact. For those that are actually staff members, if they were diagnosed themselves, there's also a difference depending on whether they individually have symptoms or not. For those that are what they call asymptomatics, they are on quarantine for 10 days from the date that they were actually diagnosed. And that's assuming that they do not ever develop any type of symptoms. If the individual does end up developing symptoms, then the extra criteria, including resolution of symptoms and being fever-free for that 72 hours, does come into play. And so there would be additional time on that as well.
Now, would they have to have any type of medical, I don't know, would they have to be released by a doctor, or they'd have to show that they're under a care of a physician, right? So, and then to return back, they would have to show some kind of a release, right?
Actually, the current guidance from the public health officials is for employers to be lenient with employees on that respect, and not necessarily require a note from the doctor saying that they are actually cleared to come back. We are using a symptom-based strategy in determining when individuals are acceptable to return to work. And that would be that same thing, resolution of the sore throat and cough, plus the individual being the fever-free. Or if they never develop symptoms at all, then it's that minimum of they must be out for at least that 10 days.
Right.
Whether they had a doctor's note to release them earlier or not, we are following that at least that 10-day rule to be on the conservative side.
Thank you. Now, my next question has to do around or centered around the HIPAA laws. At no time does an employee have to notify the employer that they've had COVID, right?
We are, if individuals are diagnosed with COVID-19, they are asked to notify our benefits department for guidance, and we are using that, the guidance that we received through the CARES Act and doing that. And then, Mark, if you want to jump in on that information as well. But we do ask that they are in contact with the benefits department. They are not required to share their status with coworkers and things like that. And as an employer, we are obligated to protect their privacy in that where if we become aware of an exposure or an actual case in a facility, that we are required to notify those that would have been in contact with an individual, but we do not identify that individual by name.
But you can say that there is an outbreak, or there has been, but you just can't identify the person according to the laws, right? So, yeah, okay. I may have some more questions later on, but thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, so Ms. Chumley, you have a question. Thank you.
Had one because I know that we're having our nurses go through some of the tracer training. And so how does that apply? So Jennifer, because I know that, there's a concern if someone in a school tests positive, and then, I know that there's the quarantine period that you're talking about, but then with the HIPAA guidelines, that seems to me like that would limit our nurses then from being able to do that trace, or is it that if we have that happen, then it just shuts the whole school? I guess I'm not putting the two together.
So yeah, those are excellent questions. And so when we would have a case on a school campus during any type of programming there, once we would be made aware of an individual testing positive, then at that point, the contact tracing would begin. We would talk to that the actual individual and ask him or her, who have you been in contact with, and and start the investigation at that point. We also, in the cases of on a school campus, and in certain departments, depending on the type of situation, we will also be consulting directly with our Metro Health Department for guidance on that, who also will assist us in the contact tracing, and they will work with that individual as well. So it's really will be a twofold, where we have our district contact tracing to get information on individuals if we need to make them aware so that they can begin their quarantine in a timely manner and limit the spread among individuals that are working closely in the same area or whatever the situation might be. But then also the Metro Health Department would also be giving us guidance, and they would also be giving the individuals guidance.
Okay, so, this is just going to be extremely challenging. We need to make sure that we keep our employees' privacy and guard their confidentiality. But let me just do a hypothetical. If a coach were to get sick, then would that take out all of the rest of the coaching staff for a 2-week quarantine?
It would depend on the situation, where the guidelines that we have, it takes into account the distance. If they were in a closed space, the amount of time the individuals would have been around other individuals, wearing of masks and other PPE in certain situations. And so that's all part of that tracing investigation that we would be conducting with the individual. And so it really depends on the distance between individuals, how big of a space they were in, and then the length of time that they were actually in contact, and whether it was repeated contact or just a one-time contact.
So that's going to make whatever the decisions are that come back about the social distancing, the wearing masks, all of that is just going to be extremely important that all of our staff follows whatever those guidelines are that we come back with.
Yes, ma'am, that's correct. And so that's part of our initial screening of staff members as well. A lot of education to be done with staff on the importance of not coming into work if you are exhibiting any type of symptoms, or you have been exposed to an individual. We've been communicating that information out throughout this whole time, and then we revisit it over and over again to make sure that they are staying home when they are sick, and that we are screening them with the screening tool that we've developed in accordance with TEA guidelines and CDC in there. And then we've been with the PPE, wearing a mask, very consistent, washing hands, social distancing, wearing your mask. Whenever you're at work, you need to be doing those things. And so it's a repeated thing that we're constantly reinforcing with them. And and we just, we're coming from the aspect that we want to keep our staff members safe and we want to keep our kids safe. And so this is something that we're going to be constantly revisiting with them for everyone's safety.
A new world. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yes,
Thanks, Jennifer. Before we move on, Mr. Lopez, did you have one more question?
Yes, I did, and it refers back to because it just, I'm thinking about it's the slide with the bus. I'm not sure. I think that's slide 13.
You should be able to see that one now.
Yes, thank you. So in reference to, we're doing all of this stuff for our staff to make sure that they're they're being checked, they're monitored, asked the questions as far as being, are they feeling any type of these symptoms? And I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at the transportation process here and what we're looking at and how we're going to load the kids up. Are we going to be doing any type of testing or asking questions before the children load up on the bus? Would there be anything, some type of questions or health questions, some type of screening for that? If
Tessie Garza, would you like to answer that?
Sure. So in the subcommittee, our subcommittee with Jessica and Jennifer, it was determined that, as you all know, we have struggled throughout the years just to complete our staffing for bus drivers and bus assistants. And if we were to do any kind of testing at the bus stop, the bus driver wouldn't be the one that would be able to, unsecure the bus to test kids. We would require a bus assistant, which currently only our special ed buses are equipped with bus assistants. So we wouldn't be able to do any kind of testing at the bus stops.
And nor, I think we discussed that we wouldn't want to refuse to allow a child on the bus at that time, not knowing if there was a parent at home or what kind of situation, that we would monitor them when they come into the building, and then we would have isolation rooms available to make parent contact and isolate the child from the other children. And as you can see, that's why it's every other seat with the current rules.
I anticipate significant changes to state guidance soon that will get at the answer to that question. I'm not saying it'll make it easier, but it's going to get at it.
Tessie, I have one more question. Tessie, what are you hearing from a national level about, as far as, the national site, what they're saying about these levels or these precautions that we're doing, and what's the best practices? What are you hearing or Tesla, I'm sorry. What are you hearing?
So what I've heard is that other states are being given the option to comply with the guidelines, that they're just guidelines for us to adhere to. However, we want to make sure that we're providing the utmost security for our students. And so we have, I believe it was last week, the TEA did open up the option for us to allow siblings to sit together on the buses. So, or children that live in the same household together, considering that they might not be siblings or maybe multiple family homes. So we would hope that on any bus, we would be able to put anywhere between 12 to 18 to possibly 20 kids. So that would help alleviate some of the problem. But we want to make sure that we're keeping the kids safe as well. We're currently meeting with vendors, talking to other districts about installing sanitizers on all the buses and things like that. Just what they're doing at the schools, and if the schools are recommending masks, we're going to recommend masks.
Right. Yeah, I mean, because I'm sure there's some type of guideline that the bus manufacturer may have and say, hey, look, this is what we recommend for using for cleaning our product, right? Our bus, this type of bus, and you'll have all of that, I'm sure. Do you currently have that right now?
So in our subcommittee, and part of the guidelines that the CDC is recommending is that the buses cleaned after each trip. So after the school bus driver picks up the kids at the bus stop, drops them off at the school, then immediately the bus needs to be sanitized. And with the new schedule that Mr. Diablo has created, having multiple custodians on the campus, I did meet with him ahead of time to see if it would be feasible for a custodian to be available during drop-off times to help with the sanitization of the buses using the ionizer sprayers that each campus currently has. And so he said that that is something that's doable. Obviously, we can't go back to the bus barn to clean it. And if we were to provide each bus driver with a spray bottle of Triad, that does take time to sit and dry. So the ionizer sprayer is our best bet because it dries within 2 minutes, and we could get the driver back on his trip and back to pick the next group of kids up.
Yeah, because I anticipate, let's say there is an exposure, right, and then we see, let's say it transfers onto the bus, but then that kind of, just like we have a late bus, right? Just like we may have a bus that's late and it comes to the class or comes to the school, and those kids are late because of, for whatever reason, right? Does this affect any of the learning time? And if it does affect the learning time, obviously it does, but, is that going to affect us anywhere as far as what, obviously, yeah, it is going to affect us. I'm looking at it and I'm thinking about it right now. So I'm sorry, that's not a question. Now I'm starting to think about it, but yeah. Okay.
We are going to have to be very creative in our scheduling. In the past, we've run a 3-tier trip with our bus drivers, but now that we would have to make multiple trips just to complete 1 tier, we're looking at a 2-tier trip with an elementary and a high school, and the middle school to be a standalone to help piggybacks with elementary or high school routes, depending on the amount of windshield time from the last pickup to the actual school.
What do you mean by tier? I don't understand what you mean.
Elementary is 1 tier, middle school is another tier, and high school is our 3rd tier. So we've traditionally run a 3 each. On average, most of our bus drivers have 3 tiers in morning and afternoon, where they pick up an elementary group, then their middle, and then their high school group.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Tessa.
Thanks, Mr. Lopez. And now, Ms. Reed, you have your hand up.
I do. Thank you. I finally was able to get it up this time. I had a question about the bus again, because I'm looking at it and thinking if we put one child next to the window and in the next row put them on an aisle seat back and forth like that, we would have twice as many people on this bus and they'd still be quite far apart. I assume that there are other options that we might be thinking about in the future.
That could be under the new guidelines, perhaps.
Okay. Well, there are other ways of doing things than just, every other row, because that really takes, I mean, that's like a wasted bus ride, bus trip to do that on both sides. So that's ridiculous. And hopefully maybe some of the parents will decide to take their own kids to school. We'll see. Thank you.
Thanks,
we will.
And I've also been reading a lot about buses and plexiglass, so that protects the driver and then they're able to use the seat. So I'm sure we'll come up with some great creative ideas, and then pending whatever the state is, we will go from there. All right. So Dr. Ward, you were 3 or 4 slides ahead. There we go.
Okay, so for the more complex plan here, if you can imagine, that's not complex, all of it's complex, right? But the academics plan to think about how many students can be in a classroom, what we do with the other students in distance learning. I'm going to turn this over to the expert for the elementary plan, to Patty Sanchez. and she is going to unmute and tell us more about some of the elementary plans. And Patty, you just let me know when you would like me to click ahead to your next slide.
Sure. Thank you, Brenda, and good evening. As we present the different options in the following slides, there was a subcommittee, an elementary academic subcommittee that gave input into the development of these options. It was based on the number of students that may be able to be in a classroom at any given time. So for example, in a 0 to 25% model, we may have anywhere from 5 to 7 students at any given time. That would be one model. A different model is if we could have up to 50% of the students in a classroom. As we developed the plans, our goal was to provide more in-person learning opportunities for the most academically at-risk students. As listed on this slide, we are giving priority to students receiving special education services, students in specialized self-contained settings, such as life skills, excuse me, BMC, and our autism units, as well as newcomer and refugee students, homeless, foster care, and migrant students. Academically at-risk students may include students who did not participate in distance learning at all during the 11 weeks, as well as students who have been identified in our response to intervention framework. So basically, the more academically vulnerable students are, the more access they will have to in-person learning. In addition to those students falling into that category, we also wanted consideration for all students to have access to some in-person learning. This will occur, you'll see in just a few slides, in a hybrid delivery system. Also keeping in mind that some families will prefer distance learning, virtual learning will continue to be an option. Decisions are pending, you see in the highlighted areas there, on children of Northside employees as well as children of essential workers, as far as where do they fall in the priority order. On the next slide, our first model considers 25% of students returning to in-person learning, if that's what the state guidelines dictate, while all other students are engaged in virtual learning. So these would be our group 1 students. This group 1, or 25% of students, consist of the student groups that were mentioned in the previous slide: the self-contained, newcomers, homeless, etc. And again, you'll see all other students in virtual learning. On the next slide, the committee considered what if 50% of students are able to be in a classroom at any given time. This 50% model continues with those group 1 students receiving daily in-person instruction, and then phases in all other students to have in-person instruction on a rotating basis. Either Monday, Wednesday would be their schedule, or Tuesday, Thursday. Then the other 3 remaining days, students in these groups would receive 3 days of virtual learning. Your group 4 students, or those parents whose families choose the virtual learning, will continue in that setting. And then finally, we'll take a look at our next priority group on the next slide. And this considers 75% of students returning or being able to be in a classroom. These include our additional academically at-risk students. Again, students who may not have been, who have not participated in distance learning, other identified at-risk students. So in this model, this identified group would have an opportunity to participate in 4 days of in-person learning, which allows for more targeted intervention time. All other students would continue with the alternating in-person days, the Monday, Wednesday, or the Tuesday, Thursday.
I think Mr. Lopez has his hand up.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, no. I was going to ask a question, and I'm not sure if this is the appropriate location or if this is the right slide. So let's say if a family chooses to do virtual, would there be any ability for them to go, they wanted to be comfortable and, feeling safe. They wanted to do virtual for first maybe a couple of weeks. Will they be able to do an in-person schedule at some point during, this process?
Yes.
Would it be that flexible?
Yes. I don't feel like we have any choice but to make it that flexible.
Okay. I was just curious. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. Now I'm going to turn it over to Deanna Dean to talk about the secondary academics plan. Deanna, let me know when you'd like me to click forward on your slides.
I will do it. Thank you, Brenda. Good evening, everyone. Before I begin, much like Patty, we had subcommittees that worked with us, and I've got to recognize Susan Cleveland and Nicole Franco, whose leadership and contributions were really key in the development of this part of the plan. And so the Secondary Academic Committee really started with two important areas of discussion, and that's student and staff schedules. And this is just an example of some of the considerations we discussed. Bus arrival and departure times, health screening for kids, breakfast to lunch, passing periods, restrooms, hand washing. And then for staff schedules, we talked about duty-free lunch, conference period, health screening, passing periods, restrooms, hand washing, and designated start-end times for possible staff coverage if students arrive or depart on staggered schedules. And then possibly a consideration of high school closed lunches, and that helps us in a variety of ways. Thank you, Brenda.
Yes.
Real quick, Deanna, Mr. Medina had his hand up, and then Ms. Chumley.
Great.
Mr. Medina?
Thank you.
I apologize. I'm going back to regarding the in-person virtual learning, the proposal or the information that was presented. And so, for example, if the parent of the child considers that the curriculum will be acquired through virtual learning, but then participates, we'll say, in orchestra, is that an option where they're learning the curriculum virtually and then they're attending classes for theater in the afternoons for a play on the weekend? Is that an option?
Mr. Medina, we're not there yet.
Okay.
We have had some conversation, but that calls a little further down the funnel from where we are.
Perfectly. All right.
Great question, though, Mr. Medina. Ms. Chumley?
Deanna, so I wanted to ask on the closed lunches, because if I'm not mistaken, one of the things that we talk about when we're talking about the size of our cafeteria and having room for kids is that we do have the open campus for junior and seniors. And so I just, I don't know, but I can certainly understand why we would say we need to have a closed campus for closed as well. Am I misunderstanding what we're talking about, Brian?
Yeah, that you are understanding. There are obvious public health reasons to not have kids coming and going during the day, but I think the feasibility of that would be determined by how many students were actually at the campus. At some number, it becomes, as you point out, very difficult to do closed lunches because the length of the time that you're serving lunch eats up a good chunk of the day. But that would depend on how many students were actually present for in-person learning.
Okay, because I was thinking we'd be starting lunches. I'm just thinking about Taft years ago where we started lunches like 10:30 and went through the day. So, okay, thank you.
Again, there are, some obvious reasons to do it, but it depends on how many students are physically present.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Then we'll move on to Deanna's next slide.
So this slide should look familiar. Ms. Sanchez reviewed this information. The information on the far left just really gives some sense about how each percent translates to an estimated number of students in the secondary classroom. The middle column is a priority order based on student need and parent circumstance, and just really kind of an example of what that might look like. Thinking about our students with the highest needs in terms of our life skills students, behavior students, our AU unit students, current students who really we couldn't connect with over the past 12 weeks, English learners, particularly our beginner and intermediate students, homeless foster migrant students, students receiving special education services, students who are 504 and dyslexia, free reduced lunch, and maybe some of our chronic absentee kids. And then we thought there may be other kind of programmatic considerations, maybe for students enrolled in AVID or industry certification programs or extracurricular activities. And then, much like the elementary plan, children of NISD employees and children of essential workers would need to be an important consideration at district decision. And then we created 4 groups of students. In the far right-hand column, you see that box of 4 students, 4 groups of students based on need in order of priority returning to in-person learning. And so, Brenda, do you mind switching for me, please?
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't catch my cue.
It's all right. And as you mentioned, secondary schedules are really complex. And so I'm going to share 4 models with you for consideration. They're really not presented in any kind of priority order. Each has pros and cons. The first option we're calling a rotating traditional schedule. There are 3 variations of this model, model A, B, and C. These particular models maintain the current daily class schedule for both middle and high school students. You see the 4 groups over to the left, and then how that translates into a delivery model. So group 1 students would always be in person. Group 2 students would always be Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Group 3 would be Tuesday, Thursday, and our group 4 students would always be virtual. So a pro of this model is it provides increased in-person teaching based on student need. The higher the student need, the more face time they have with teachers. And so if you think about this over a 10-day period, your group 2 students would have 6 days of in-person teaching, and group 3 would have 4 days of in-person teaching. The next one, Brenda. So this is model B, also a rotating traditional schedule. Much like model A, it maintains the current daily class schedule for both middle and high school students. It's the same as model A for groups 1 and 4. The difference in this model is really group 2 and 3. So group 1 are always in person. Group 2 and 3 would rotate in person and virtual daily. And group 4 would always be virtual. And so like model A, this provides students more students to benefit from in-person learning. However, it really doesn't differentiate in-person time by student need. If you go back to that 10-day example, for group 2 and 3, each of those groups would have 5 days of in-person and 5 days of virtual. And model C still maintains the current daily class schedule for both middle and high school students. Group 1 students are always in person. Group 2 students are always Monday, Wednesday. Group 3 would always be Tuesday, Thursday. And group 4 would be always Friday in person. And so unlike the other models presented, this allows us to get that group 4 some in-person time with our teachers. And so if you think about that over a 10-day period, group 2, your Monday, Wednesday group would be 4 days of in-person. Your group 3, your Tuesday, Thursday group would also be 4 days of in-person. But now your group 4, we pick up 2 days of in-person time with that particular group. And the fourth and final model is really just our traditional schedule. And so this creates a consistent daily schedule for a specific group of kids. You see we would bring back groups over time as we were allowed to do so, from your 25% all the way up to 100%. Each day the same group of kids would be either in person or virtual. And again, it creates a daily schedule, really familiar to parents, really predictable and routine over time. And so that concludes the secondary task force presentation on possible return to school options.
Ms. Chumley, did you have a question? And then Ms. Freeman.
I did. So Deanna, when you were talking about the considerations and you had underneath possible other considerations, the AVID industry certifications, extracurriculars, because there's some programs where they may not be working towards a certification, but say their junior year works towards requirements that they'll need for their senior year, where they then will be doing their testing. So it seems to me that I guess what I'm asking is that the task force on this piece not lose sight of the impact of not having in person on some of our CTE programs.
Yes.
You know, because those building foundations as a freshman at CCA, you know, may not be what, you know, it's not going to be like a junior or senior who at that point is taking a certification, but it absolutely is going to be something that they're going to have those hands-on skills to continue in that whole certificate program up with CCA. And so, and there's others, the auto mechanics, I mean, welding. There's so many classes that there's only so much where you can provide a virtual learning environment. So I just, you know, I just really hope that when the task force is looking, because I absolutely understand everything in the priority order in relation to the students that we need to look at, take care of. But then the other piece is some of the students that are in that priority list, those CTE programs and those extracurriculars are what keeps them in school in the first place. And the hands-on piece of it is what keeps them in the CTE programs as well. So I don't know, I'm really worried about those classes that we just really can't convert to a virtual learning and be delivering what we need to our kids. So I'm just asking if y'all please really keep that in mind when you're looking at your proposals. Thank you.
Yeah, Trustee Chumley, I really appreciate that. And it was you know, I started by talking about the complexity of the secondary schedule, and it's really hard to work in absolutes when you talk about a secondary schedule for exactly the reasons you talked about. And so they really would be considerations and would have to be really kind of addressed on a need basis. And so I appreciate that feedback.
Thank you. And thank you for this. I mean, there's so many factors. I'm amazed. I think y'all have done a lot. You can tell there's been a lot of effort in it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can jump in real quick. Now that we're kind of through this portion, I want to be clear that these hybrid models, these schedules that we looked at are not what we want to happen. We would love to have every family that wants their child back in a school building, back in a school building. And we feel like we need to set up a system that serves with really good fidelity those who choose for a small period of time or a long period of time to stay in virtual learning. So we're trying to set up a system that will allow for both of those desires and allow, as I think somebody asked about earlier, if a family were to need to transition from in the building to out of the building, or because of a public health need, we were to need to transition students from in the building to out of the building, the system has to be set up such that it's nimble enough to do that. So while we look at a lot of options here with regard to only very small groups of students in the building, that is not the goal. And pending state guidance, that will not be what we recommend. We're just trying to explore all of our options and cover what the public health need is, along with what families desire.
Okay, Ms. Freeman. You need to unmute, please.
Okay, got it. So the master schedule, the person who does this before COVID is setting up the master schedule is complex at best. This probably makes it the complexity tenfold or even more. I saw early on recommendations from the CDC that students were to not have, the optimum would be to minimize the number of teachers that they have. Has there been any thought, in sixth grade, at least in the past, we used to team teach, or the students would move as a team. Any thought to even trying that in the middle school level to limit exposure at 7th and 8th grade or anywhere else?
We did consider that. One of our goals, Trustee Freeman, going into this was to maintain student choice and needs in terms of elective choices and endorsements of high school industry certifications, coherent sequence. And so as we start connecting kids to a specific set of teachers, it requires to a degree that all the kids need basically the same thing. And we see wild variance in terms of what kids are interested in and what they need. And so I certainly wouldn't say that wouldn't be a consideration or a best practice, but it's there's some pros and cons to it as we think about it. And maybe the pros do outweigh the cons. We'll see what guidance comes in August a bit, and what flexibility we have.
Yeah, I think the challenge with that is we've made a significant effort in the last few years to create more elective choice specifically for our middle school students. And so that makes that kind of scheduling obviously much more complex to accomplish.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, and I had a real quick question. I'm seeing is there another board member who has a question? Okay. No, Deanna was, and I didn't, and maybe this is a Brenda question. Was anyone on the task force from Learning Tree? Because I'm wondering if my child, let's say, is not one of the 4 in-person groups, and I still need to work full time. Is there some sort of either blend or support from Learning Tree or nonprofits or community-based organizations or whatever to perhaps either use our facilities to support like mariachi or something like that, or chess, or I don't know, but just support time so parents aren't going one place or another, or parents can work full time or whatever.
Yes, yes, absolutely, Dr. Harrell. Oh, sorry, Dr. Woods, go ahead.
Yeah, I just, the out-of-school providers had a meeting with the Bexar County superintendents today, and we've all given contact people to work towards that goal. Should we not be able to have every kid, every family that wants their children in buildings physically there every day?
Great. And then the other question I had is some of the teachers had shared that a need, and I had reached out to Dr. Jordan, but kind of a warehouse, a platform, like a learning management system, so they weren't going from Google to something else to help coordinate both virtual and in person. That was a part of secondary. Was it a part of elementary as well, a consistent, and I keep calling it a warehouse, but a learning management system without getting technical, where everything is stored and kids can come in and out, teachers have kind of a one-stop shopping support?
Yes, absolutely, Dr. Harrell. You have read my mind.
So Dr. Harrell, since you and I chatted about that, and of course some new, kind of teasers from what might possibly come from the state, about 30 of us actually had a webinar. I mentioned to you that we'd reviewed Canvas, specifically looking at that for secondary, and then had about 30 of us review Schoology, which is really intended as a K-12 solution. We literally did that this afternoon. As we're going back and looking at, the requirements of a system to be able to create electronic records for students' daily activity. We're looking at what we have in place is not going to cut it. So Google Classroom is not robust enough for that. So we are expanding beyond just looking at high school for an LMS.
Okay.
Dr. Hart's question brings up an important point, though. Until we know exactly what the state guidance is around funding for distance learning, it's hard to pick a product that meets those needs. So that would be a priority coming up. But Janice and her team are on top of that. That is a non-negotiable in this environment.
Of course. All right. Thank you. All right. Brenda, distance learning.
Thank you, Dr. Harrell. Our next tab is distance learning, and you can see how everything is interrelated. But the distance learning must be at the same level of rigor as the classroom instruction for the 2021 school year. We cannot do that with some of our current products, and so the task force has recommended several items, such as what you just mentioned with the learning management system for secondary, a product that we used in some classrooms called Seesaw for pre-K, kinder, and first grade. A video recording device for teachers to be able to record a lesson and then put it in a distance learning management system. Student devices that work well with the learning management system, Wi-Fi hotspots as needed, and possibly extra Zoom central office accounts to hold large group meetings that we often do with principals meetings where there's, maybe a couple hundred people on a meeting. And they also considered that in a 5-page report that is available in the binder that we need training materials for students, parents, and teachers, and we need to have them ready for the fall. A device distribution and collection plan, and possible procurement of the items on the previous slide so that we can easily pivot from that in-person learning. And then if a school did have to close for either the rolling closures or for a sanitation, if somebody at the campus has COVID and we need to sanitize the school, that we would be ready to pivot and go to distance learning for any learner.
Dr. Ward, can you go back a slide, 2 slides?
Yes, sir.
So when we were talking in the budget presentation, we mentioned that a lot of expenses related to this situation had not been incurred. This is the list of some of those expenses, in addition to PPE and those other things you would expect. These are where the dollars are going to be spent. Sorry, Brenda.
Yes, sir. Good point.
Do you have a question real quick? Ms. Chumley, did you have a question?
I did, but you know what, Carol, let me wait and let's go through this.
Okay.
And it may be answered. So I'll just wait. I'm going to keep my hand up though until we get a little further. Okay. Thank you.
We're making good progress. As you can imagine, we are concerned about providing our students, staff, and community social and emotional supports along with the academic supports. So this subcommittee put together a plan starting with the adults as they arrive back on campus in late summer and early fall. And the school counselors would be prepared to both acknowledge the adult trauma from the experience of not completing the school year in the building with their students. And then the counselors would be prepared to train the teachers to ensure they understand the needs and the feelings and the trauma of their students, and that they can focus on that social and emotional learning to ensure a smoother transition for our students back to in-person learning. Learning Tree is part of the plan, as we were talking about earlier. They're actually going to be our model. They're opening this summer, and they will institute many of the items you've already heard discussed in the plan. And so they are going to have the safety measures in place. And we are very interested in showing our community what these safety measures look like so that they can be assured what will be in store for their students possibly in the fall, depending on what the rules are in August. And so they've put together a detailed plan that is an example. This is just an example of social distancing and hygiene practices that they would use. And for summer school, it's the same. They have to take all of the considerations from the academic plan to the public health accommodations and the school personnel. and they are going to start in July, giving opportunities for the community to see not only our safety practices, but especially for the students to get the benefit of our academic plan to lessen any learning loss from the spring. So summer school has that same plan as the fall, but just on a smaller scope with less students and less teachers in the buildings. And then we did have Debbie McNerney on our task force, and we definitely will need data. If you can imagine the scheduling that somebody brought up, and that's why Susan Cleveland was on our team also, when we have to think about our comprehensive high schools and thousands of students. So Debbie McNerney and her team has created data by individual student for each campus where they can consider those students that are the priority to come back in person at 25, 50, or 75%, and who would come back. So we would use data to help those master schedulers. And this is a view of one of the data pieces that she created where you can actually say in a column that there's 10 students per room, depending on what the guidelines are, or now 16 per room. How many teachers do we have on that campus? How many classrooms are available? And we could actually be very proactive in knowing how many students could actually come back to a campus and how many would have to do distance learning. And then finally, getting to some data points, we've done a large-scale survey and PTA town hall meetings. And so first of all, to speak to the PTA town hall meetings, Dr. Woods met with PTA board presidents and asked a couple of questions that I'm going to share with you here. The first one, what factors or considerations would make you most comfortable with your child coming back to school? You can see the top 3 options there that they chose were disinfecting was important, social distancing, and class size. And then you can see the other guidelines that they thought were important for their child to come back to school for in-person. And then another question that was posed, how would you feel about an option to continue distance learning, either completely or partially for your child? So a partial model would be both the in-person and the online, as you heard in the academic plan. So 11 said a partial or mixed would be okay. Several 8 said yes, just whether it's distance learning, whether it's partial or complete, they were on board. 4 had some reservation and wanted more instruction with the distance learning, and I think they mean like direct instruction from the teacher, possibly videoing the lessons and putting them on. 4 felt no, 3 felt that just the distance learning and not the back and forth of a partial, and 2 selected a year-round option. And then to move on to our community opinion survey, it was conducted by Baslis and Associates, and they prepared the survey, and Barry Pettis sent out the link to our community, to our parents and guardians, and it was offered both in English and Spanish, and 96% took it in English, and 4% of our community took it in Spanish. And it was a pretty lengthy survey. There's a lot of results, and it took on average about 19 minutes with about 14,454 parents responding. And that was conducted between June 2nd and June 7th. And then alongside that survey, there was a separate survey with similar questions posed to our staff. So you can see that some teachers, administrators, and other staff members were also able to respond. And I'm going to show those results kind of side by side where they're similar so that you can see how staff feel compared to our parents. Staff results, mostly elementary, 21% at middle and 25% at high school, which of course we have more elementary teachers. And 39% indicated that they were both an employee and a parent of a Northside student, with 61% being employees only. And we had basically 10 key findings that we would like to share with you tonight. So a majority, 50% of our parents are very concerned about COVID-19 impacting their health and the health of those in their household. And a plurality of 47% do not think people in the community are taking this seriously enough. And the staff results pretty much mirror that, with the staff 47% saying very concerned, 38% saying somewhat concerned, and 50%, a little bit higher, thought that the community was not taking the COVID-19 situation seriously enough. Another key finding of our parents is that 47% of parents say that the district has done an excellent job responding to COVID-19. 40% say great job, good job, and 12% say fair or poor. Additionally, 58% of parents are concerned about their child falling behind because of virtual or online learning, while 42% are not concerned about that. Another key finding is that initially 47% are somewhat or very comfortable sending their child back to school, so a little less than half. At this point, at the beginning of the survey, we did ask some open-ended questions, and Baselis and Associates will give us those results in about a week so that we can see what would make parents feel more comfortable to be able to send their child back to school. That was open-ended. So if we talk about the initial comfort level, 47% are comfortable and 48% are not comfortable. And so there were some correlations there with other questions that were asked in that survey to include their view of COVID-19, their experience with virtual learning. Did they have a good experience or not a very good experience? And their expected household work situation in the fall. Do both parents need to go back to work in person, or will there be someone at home to work with students that would be using the distance learning? So the staff survey results, similarly, 57% reported that they were very or somewhat comfortable with returning to school in the fall for work, and it was about 10 points higher than the parent survey. Another key finding of the parent survey was that initially 23% of parents want school to start as normal. So let's go back, open the doors, let's all go back as normal. Or 45% want to start with significant changes for social distancing, and 33% said they wanted to start online only. And you're going to see a change in this data as we go through the survey and present some information to them. The staff, 20% felt the schools should reopen as close to normal as possible, and 53% said they should reopen with significant changes, and 27% felt that it should only be online. This was a little different than a little bit of a shift than what the parents felt. Another key finding in a scenario where school starts as normal, on average, 62% say they would send their child back to school. Here's where the survey presented a bunch of information to them where they could rate how important certain public health accommodations are to them. And so you can see some blue arrows where the parents strongly supported some items, and they are hand sanitizer, cleaning protocols, and alerts to parents if there is a new case of COVID-19 at their campus. And then the least supported, believe it or not, is keeping the kids in the same classroom all day. I guess parents were having a hard time visualizing their students staying in the same classroom all day long. But once these items were presented, I think parents felt more secure that we were taking lots of these considerations carefully, and it changed their mind on some of the key findings, which I'll present to you. So after learning about those safety measures the district may take, 40% of the parents had an increased comfort level. So this really shows that our communication plan and actually showing parents, you know, what we are, taking seriously during summer school and during Learning Tree this summer will be very important. So now a total of 73% said they were somewhat or very comfortable sending their child back to school once they knew about the safety measures that we could take. In a scenario where the school reopened it in the alternating or the hybrid model, which you heard about, on average, about 35% said they would send their child back to school, and 49% said it would depend on which model. And alternating days were the most preferred. And you can see that that's what Patty and Deanna both presented. So here's a little more information or a breakdown on that. It was a follow-up preference question following the other one, where 18% said they would like to send their child a half a day, but 5 days a week. 37% said alternating days would work better for their family, and 26% chose alternating weeks, and 20% preferred none, so they would choose the distance learning. If you look at the net favor, you can see that the alternating days is definitely the favored choice of our community from this survey. I thought it might greatly differ by grade level which plan they would pick, and it didn't really differ. The plan was pretty close at each grade level in what the preference was. So there was, in a final question, kind of closing up the survey, it was mentioned that the data showed that 73% would keep their children at home if cases were increasing in the community level. So here's where we would have to be prepared for a 2-week closure or 4-week closure, depending on community breakout in the San Antonio area, and that parents would want their child then, if they were in person, to be learning from home. So we would have to be prepared to pivot and have those children familiar with online distance learning already, and then just never miss a day of school, and they pick up the next day with the distance learning. So parents were able to pose their initial positions on starting school. 34% said, let's just start the way things were. And 6% unsure, and 60% said, hey, let's rethink how we educate. And so if we're thinking about buying devices for students, one-to-one, or some of the other items presented in the distance learning, we have a great opportunity to rethink many things in how we educate our students. And then on the right side, when do they want that to happen? Some want them to come as soon as possible, 46%. And then unsure, 19%, and 35% said until there's no risk that they did not want school to restart as normal. The staff said only 30% responded that Northside should focus on trying to get back to the way things were, while 63% said we should focus on rethinking how we educate our students. Very similar to the parents' responses. This is a lot of information on the slide, but just to show you that as far as parents wanting to open as normal, you can see there's not a large variance among the grade levels on the left-hand side. And then if we talk about the hybrid models on the right side, you can see the alternating hybrid model and the grade levels and what the preference is there. Also for on the right-hand column for learning at home. This is a data model just to show you that as we presented the safety measures, parents changed their comfort level on sending their child back, and it greatly increased. So if they said somewhat, many of them answered that they were very comfortable, or if they were not very comfortable, they moved to somewhat comfortable. So definitely having our safety measures out there for the public to hear about are very important. The staff also said after learning about those measures, 33% reported that they were very comfortable and 46% somewhat comfortable returning to work in the fall. So a little bit slightly higher than the parents reported. Staff survey results also said if a school was open and staff had the option to work or teach from home, 53% would want to return to campus, 22% would work or teach from home 100% of the time, and 25% were unsure. So as far as informed preferences for this coming school year, 62% of those with increased comfort, so they heard about the health measures we would take and their comfort increased, they went up to 91% sending their child to school on a hybrid schedule and felt very comfortable with that. Where 80% of those who initially wanted online only, and they would keep their child at home, but that really decreased down to 42% once they heard about the social distancing alternating hybrid option. So I think communication will be key as we move forward. More informed preferences, as I think some of the board members have discussed, parents of the high school students who are in activities like UIL, they came out as the most likely to want their child to return to school, and they see the importance of returning to school for those other activities that their child is involved in. And on average, viewpoints about returning to school among the parents of special education students were very similar to the total sample. 48% of parents were consistent in their response in sending their child back to school in an alternating hybrid model, but they want to know which model will be chosen before they would commit. And then here is a slide showing if there is increasing breakout of COVID-19 in our community, what would the parent comfort level be in sending their child? So you can see here 73% would want their child to learn from home as community outbreak would increase. Getting close to the end. So bus transportation, as we discussed earlier, very important. 28% of the respondents say that they expect to be dependent on the bus to get their child to school when school starts in the fall. And 84% indicated that they would send their child to school on the bus, you know, if there was social distancing and if it was cleaned. And in contrast, 37% of the parents said they would send their child to school on the bus, even in the usual capacity of 72. Meals, 28% of the respondents indicated that their family qualifies for and participates in free and reduced lunch program for the people that replied to the survey. 18% reported taking advantage of the free grab-and-go meals from the district after schools were closed this spring. And 11% indicated that due to their current situation, they will need food assistance over the summer before school starts again. Just a little bit on extending the school year and asking parents' opinions on that. 68% are in support of extending the school year a minimum of 1 to 2 weeks. And then 3 to 4 weeks went down to 27% and then 26%. And 32% of our parents answered that they opposed extending the school year. Additionally, 58% are supportive of extending the school day by at least 30 minutes. 1 hour led with 37%, and 35% opposed extending the school day. And staff results, you can imagine on the similar topic that 45% of the staff opposed extending the school year and 49% opposed extending the school day. Similar to parents, staff showed the same support or opposition to the measures school districts are considering. They support the hand sanitizer, enhancing cleaning protocols, and alerts to parents of the new cases. And they were less supportive of keeping the kids in the same classroom all day, and restrictions on high-risk activities and closing the campus for 2 weeks. So that is the end of our presentation today. So any additional questions that we can help with tonight while we have the task force available?
Chumley. Ms. Chumley?
Yes, Carol. So I think, Tessie, I'm going to jump back a little bit on the slides. So Tessie, you were in charge of the transportation one. I just wanted to share with you, so I have gotten some bus drivers that have asked if the task force could make sure and consider that if we're looking at doing any kind of shields for the bus drivers, that, and those bus drivers that in the buses that are not air conditioned, that the thought of having to sit behind a plastic shield is discouraging or challenging some of them on the thought of continuing, because it's so hot anyway if they have to sit behind a plastic shield. So just, you know, I just wanted to share that with you, is that our bus drivers are looking at and thinking about what their buses could look like in trying to have the social distancing and keeping the kids safe, but they're also concerned about their own comfort in relation to the buses that aren't air conditioned. So I wanted to share that. And then I wanted to ask on the distance learning. So when talking about distance learning, there's so many variables out there. And so I remember at the very beginning, I had talked to Dr. Jordan about, you know, my picture of what distance learning was in my mind versus, you know, what some of it was, some of it could be. And so what I was thinking of is, you know, the classroom where the teacher gets up, they know they have a 9 o'clock class. They open their class on some type of a management system and take a roll. Kids are there. They're all their faces on whatever the platform, Zoom or whatever it is. They're all interacting. And then, you know, the next period, the teachers, staff period, I can't remember what it's called. I've gone completely blank, pardon me, but their working period. Conference. Thank you, Carol. Their conference period. And then they go to the next class. And so that's kind of what I was thinking distance learning should look like. And then when Dr. Jordan and I were talking, she was explaining, you know, kind of the challenges of being able to do that in a district our size with the number of students that we have. However, if I'm a parent and I'm answering those questions on that survey, Dr. Ward, a lot of what that distance learning is going to look like is going to influence that. So I'm just curious if there was any discussion within this survey or anything that kind of led the asked what distance learning, what parents thought distance learning should look like, or what their expectation of distance learning was when they were answering these questions about so many of them feeling comfortable or wanting a hybrid program. And then the other piece, question 2, is when y'all were talking about distance learning, what was your picture of it? Was it really more where you were having a teacher have a class, have the interaction within the students, or was it more of, you know, picking up work, or having some platform that had lessons and kids just went in and picked it up? I mean, we had a hybrid of distance learning those last couple of months, you know, of school. But I think that in my mind would really influence how parents feel about the hybrid or about the virtual, the distance learning. And that's a piece that seems to me we don't have an answer for. So I'm just wondering, you know, was there any discussion or anything like that within that survey? Or what kind of did we present as the picture or model of what distance learning looks like to our parents?
Yeah, so I'll take that. We think about distance learning in 2 ways, but that a child is not locked into one of the 2 ways. So I could distance learn, as you described, in a synchronous way, where I tune in to my second period class, I watch the teacher teach the lesson, and then I go off and I work on whatever the task is that allows me to prove that I've learned something, and perhaps I return the next day to the same period. That's synchronous distance learning. But we also have to think about distance learning in an asynchronous way, where because of the family circumstance, because a child is working due to family economic situation, they still have to be able to access the lessons in a way that is not in real time. And so we think that distance learning is going to look very different family to family because of the circumstances involving the parent work schedule, involving the child's other responsibilities outside of going to school. And we've got to be flexible in order to allow that to happen as long as the child is making progress. Now, if they're not making progress, we're going to have to intervene in that, obviously. And that was much more challenging to do while all schools were closed. We anticipate that that will be easier to do when schools, at least to some degree, are reopened in the fall.
I guess, Brian, that just leads my question, though, is, you know, I know there's school the way it was, and then there's what new school is going to look like. At some point, at some point, there's going to be a responsibility on the parents' piece of this. To step up in relation to what we are able to offer. When I'm thinking about all this, I'm just looking and trying to grasp. There are going to be so many. There's going to be so many pieces of this. I'm worried that if we try to provide all things to all people, that it will be a lot harder. And I know that I come from the corporate world where we look at 80-20 when we look at any kind of initiative or program or process. And I don't know, I'm concerned about that piece of it. And I certainly recognize that we need to be sensitive to our families and our parents. But I do think that this is a time when our families and our parents are really going to have to step up and be sensitive to their role in assisting the district as well. I like the picture of distance learning where, you know, you have a standard day, because I think some kids do really well when they have, you know, and I'm sorry, I'm not very articulate tonight, where they really have structure. And then I think that there's a lot of kids that don't do well without that structure. And I see that is a real challenge in my mind with distance learning, is being able to still maintain that structure. And I'm really wondering if you know, once we have kind of a model of what distance learning will really look like, that survey would not change some. I don't know. I think that parents, you know, because if they're a parent like me, my view of distance learning may absolutely not be what my neighbor's view of distance learning is, and that could certainly have an impact on how I feel about the responses on that survey. So I'm just a little worried about that piece of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee. Do you have a question?
Oh, I just kind of want to make a response, or just kind of add to the conversation of what Melissa was talking about with the distance learning. You know, and the survey is almost kind of reflective of what I've been talking about, or who I've been talking to in my community. You know, there is a legitimate concern, and I think what we've done with the survey, it's really has identified for us what their major concerns were. And is that us keeping our kids safe through sanitizing, through wiping, through, you know, everything that we're going to do, right? And that does really reflect a lot of what some of the members in my community, in talking with them, are really feeling. They say they want to know that their kids, that the place is clean, the teachers are practicing social distancing, and all the kids are going to practice social distancing. But, you know, they want to ease into this. They're still skeptical, but, you know, some of them are not hesitant, or in my discussions with them, they're saying, look, you know, if I don't feel comfortable, I'm not going to send my kid back. I'm not going to expose them. And in that conversation, it's because there's a trust factor that other people are going to do the same thing. They're going to practice social distancing. They're going to wear a mask, or, you know, That's their biggest concern, because they feel like, look, if I'm doing this for my kid and my kid is going to be wearing a mask and practice social distancing, how do I know that the other kids aren't going to do that? Because we know kids will be kids. So they're struggling with that. And they struggle with that even more so at an elementary level, where they know that the children at a pre-K or first grade or second grade, they're just not going to be, in that line like they're supposed to, right? They're, the social skills that they need to have. So there are some legitimate concerns there as to, how much learning will be involved or will be taking place if the teacher, one, is having to manage expectations or is having to manage behavior and making sure that all the kids are following directions and social distancing and aren't taking off their masks, things like that. They're concerned with that. And so, that's what I've heard in the community. They know that the high school level, kids will have that better concept of social distancing and practicing all those skills, but it's more at the elementary level that they're concerned about. But I think that survey is reflective of what some of the community is saying and what I'm hearing. But they're really overall are wanting to make sure that their kid is safe, and so that's just my take on what was presented as far as the survey.
Thank you. Ms. Freeman?
Yeah, Dr. Harrell, I have a comment and then a question for Dr. Woods. To the task force, much like Dr. Barajas is helping us develop a budget based on many unknowns. I see your work here on this task force. You're working on different scenarios based on a lot of assumptions that are ever changing. And so I see your work on this task force as being intense the entire school year. So I really appreciate you helping us with this. My concern in looking at the results of the survey, there were a couple places where staff and our community expressed some hesitancy about sending their kids to school should COVID numbers rise. We didn't define what rise means. And I look at currently the state where in our state, we have increased numbers, but there doesn't seem to be a number in which we know that the state will pull back something or seems to be concerned about something. Dr. Woods, in your discussion with local superintendents and such, so let me back up. I'm not sure I have confidence that the state is actually going to pull back in time. When you look at when numbers increase, I know they talk about looking at hospital beds, but when numbers increase, sometimes hospital beds don't get filled up. The number of beds is based on 2 weeks prior, perhaps. Are y'all thinking about what that scenario might look like? Just because we can be open doesn't necessarily mean that we should. Help me out, Dr. Woods.
Yeah, so the answer to the question is yes. We've had some of those conversations. I'll tell you, we're a long way from putting metrics to that. But we have had some conversations that perhaps as a region, as an area, we would try to stay on the same page around generalized closings. I think that's what you're talking about, not just a particular classroom or a school because of an infection, but a more generalized closing. The challenge there again is going to come back to, and this is the reason why I'm going to pull the next item on our agenda about calendar. The challenge there is that until we get better guidance from the state and we understand all of its implications, it's very difficult to contemplate generalized closure because of its potential funding implications. And I'll have a lot more to say about that once that guidance gets released.
I think our community trust in us will depend upon how well we communicate as a district to them, and how open we are. So I appreciate this candid conversation here, or discussion, and as we go on, I assume we'll do the same.
We will. That is in the cards for sure.
Thank you.
And I had a real quick, I'm glad you brought up trust. When we looked at enrollment for this summer and also current pre-K enrollment, there was a comment, I believe at academics, that our numbers have been tremendous, which I think shows trust and comfort and confidence. Do you happen to have those numbers to share? I know with our own family members, you know, there's a lot of confidence and trust. And so I was just hoping that I wasn't just making that up.
No, you're not making that up. I think when we look at the combination, now summer programming is offered in many different ways. So we have some summer programming that will stand up in the first week in July that is in person. We've also got at the K-5 level some hybrid where students will be in person some days and learning from home some days.
Right.
You've got several in-person only, distant only options. When you look at total enrollment, with the exception of maybe the 6th through, well, no, not with it. I take it back. Without that exception, K-12, we are at a much, much larger number of summer enrollment than we ever have been. In pre-K-5, that number, the last time I saw it, was north of 22,000 students enrolled in at least one offering, some enrolled in more than one. There's a very large number enrolled in our middle school kids who want to take a high school credit course for the summer, and that is also true of high school students who want to take an additional high school course for the summer. So overall, summer enrollment, both the in-person and the distant, is quite healthy, which was not an item we discussed tonight with regard to budget, but will be one. But we'd said all along, once we went out of school, that the more students we could get in summer programs, from catch-up programs to enrichment programs, the better off they would be in the fall. And that, so far, that goal is being met very well, actually.
So to that point, the survey came out at the beginning of June. So will there be some sort of exit survey for the families that have been involved in the multiple summer programs to get a sense of how either engaging or safe or whatever they felt they were, to help inform our look ahead?
I think that's been a part of our normal process for summer programming, so I don't think that's an add-on.
Okay.
With regard to surveying, I will say that we're going to put out a very similar survey to the one you saw results from in early July and start to measure whether attitudes have shifted at all in that regard.
Okay. Well, thank you. I see Ms. Chubley, do you still have a question? And then Ms. Freeman.
I just, one thing, and I know it's probably off further down the road, is that regardless of what we do with distance learning, I really have some concerns in relation to that piece of it. Is most important thing is that we're educating kids as well as we can, and everyone agrees with that. So within the scope of developing what distance learning is, are we putting in there, or are we considering, because again, it may be that it's further down in the development phase, is how we improve the distance learning. But the other piece is, God, I just cannot think of words tonight. I am so sorry. Is the checks and balances? How do we make sure that the distance learning is actually educating our kids? How do we measure? That's what I'm thinking. How do we measure the distance learning in relation to the progress of our students? Because I think that's something that, you know, we were really focused on just making sure that we were getting education to our kids over this last, and I completely understand. And that's what we needed to do. But if we have programs or schedules set up with distance learning, particularly the one that is all virtual, you know, how are we going to make sure that we have within that measurements to make sure that our kids are progressing and that they are getting the education that they need? And then there's the whole other factor where you look at a matrix of which teachers may do a better job with distance learning, or where do we do the staff development for those. If we look at, we had to pull the trigger and everyone had to do distance learning in one campus, that we make sure that we have that piece in. And I know those are all little pieces of it that probably are in the weeds, but I don't want to lose sight of those, because I think that those are important pieces of the distance learning conversation. So is that something further coming, or has that been part of the task force discussion when they're talking about that?
I think those are all pretty relevant now. So things are, I mean, there's a healthy conversation going on around how we're going to train people. We know that what we did in mid-March was just get it out there. And we know the bar is going to have to raise to whatever degree we've got students in distance learning for the coming year. So training is something that's certainly being planned for all staff, not select staff, but all staff. And then we're looking at, as we mentioned before, learning management systems, which help get at what you're saying around measuring the progress of students as we go along. And I think it's important to reiterate that that while we feel like standing up distance learning is an absolute non-negotiable for the fall, that if students are not progressing well, that'll require a conversation with the family to say, perhaps you need to come back into the building as you may be more successful with that structure and in front of those teachers.
Which that piece of it, Brian, I'm just worried about the measurement piece of that, you know, because you wouldn't want to wait to go through the end of December or the first semester, recognizing that kids just aren't progressing on distance learning. I just think there's a lot of components on it that we just need to make sure that each area gets the review that it needs to.
Yeah, there's no reason why it would take a semester to determine that. You would know in a matter of weeks if it wasn't being successful, and you could try to intervene.
Okay, and I just had one question to Lori. You know, I remember when we put the system that we have for our data management into place, that we talked about its capabilities and was it something that could be expanded? And that was one of the things that we liked about the system. So is there anything that can be helpful or can be expanded or can be added on the system that we have now? We're talking about having to go through a full expense of having a complete learning management system, a whole new one.
Yeah, unfortunately, Miss Chumley, the learning management system would be something that would be totally separate. It's a different type of technology system. It would be something that doesn't normally come as part of that type of data warehouse type system.
Okay, I was just thinking about, Lori, and back to, you know, the measurement piece of it. If it was something that would be easier for teachers to be able, you know, to input follow grades and track that data, that would be something, I think, Brian, that would be helpful for teachers who are doing the virtual, teaching. If we had something that was easy for them to be able to track where students' progress is. Anyway, that was it. I want to thank all of you. I know you've put in a lot of work, and I appreciate that all of you are taking this very seriously and recognizing all of the integral pieces. Thank you.
So if I can provide a little wrap up, just to be clear. So what you've seen tonight is not a plan, but a list of options depending upon what might happen with regard to scenarios. Just to be really clear, what we're trying to develop is a system that encourages students to come back to our buildings and educates, to the degree that we're allowed to for state guidance, as many students as we possibly can in our buildings, in our classrooms, with our teachers. But we also recognize, and I think the survey data speaks to it pretty well, that distance learning is going to be the choice, at least for some period of time, for some families. And we will need to stand up really robust distance learning to include the technology that supports that to offer to those families. And we've got to create a system that's nimble enough to allow students to move, either because of illness or because of choice, from distant to in-person or vice versa. And we've got to make nimble enough that if a classroom had to be closed for whatever period of time, that we could transition those students from in-person to distant overnight, and that it would be seamless for the kids and that learning would not be lost. That's a lofty goal, but that's the system that we're trying to build, and that's the system that this task force work is contemplated.
And Dr. Woods, that's a great way to put a bow on this. I don't think any of us doubt that our district can't rise above this and do even more incredible things. And again, to echo Ms. Chumley's thank you, and on behalf of the board task force, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I just ended with a real quick question. The task force role is not over. Are they still going to be with us? Okay, so Brenda's going like this. I see lots of enthusiasm and excitement. So we'll just leave it at that. This isn't goodbye to the task force, but thank you. And we'll move right along with great plans and great ideas. So on behalf of the board, thank you guys so much, and gals. Thank you, thank you.
I think some of the members of the task force would love to hear that this work is over. I think these are all smart people, and they realize that we're a long, long way from this work being over.
Yeah, but what a giant leap. So thank you all very much. And we are now going to Superintendent, item 16, Dr. Woods.
Yeah, so Dr. Harrell, I'm gonna pull this item. We had hoped when we put this agenda together that we would have enough state guidance to have a conversation around the instructional calendar. That simply has not happened. And until it does, and until we have some time to analyze that guidance and think through what's in the best interest of our staff and our students and our funding, we're not gonna be ready to have that conversation. So we'll delay this one and bring it back to the board as soon as we can. I recognize that parents and staff are anxious around the calendar, but again, don't want to put out a recommendation and have people start to make plans around it only to have to pull it back and make major changes. So we'll get back to this item as quick as we can.
All right. Is there any discussion from the board or any questions, comments?
Just keep plugging away.
Plug-in's a good word. Plug-in's a good word.
It's going to be a long haul. It's going to be a lot longer than what we anticipated. We certainly appreciate all the extra work that you all have done. So thanks, and especially to you, Dr. Woods.
Yeah, we're in good hands. We're in good hands. Well, with that final compliment, we are going to end this called board meeting at 7:52 p.m. Everyone go out, stay well, be healthy, and have some fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.